Is Final Fantasy XIII-2 worth playing? Yes. Especially if you like Final Fantasy XIII, or you dislike Final Fantasy XIII. Let me explain. I love Final Fantasy XIII. I think it's a fantastic JRPG and a great Final Fantasy game, but it definitely has a lot of valid criticism. And Final Fantasy XIII-2, in a lot of ways, is a direct response to this criticism. Final Fantasy XIII is too linear. In Final Fantasy XIII-2, all levels are more or less open, with branching paths and a lot of areas that require you to travel back to them. In Final Fantasy XIII, the battle system doesn't open until 25 hours into the game. In Final Fantasy XIII-2, the battle system is open from the beginning and only opens up more later on. Not enough NPCs and side quests in Final Fantasy XIII. Tons of NPCs and side quests in Final Fantasy XIII-2. In Final Fantasy XIII, you can only save at specific save stations. In Final Fantasy XIII-2, you can save wherever you like, and the game autosaves for you. Final Fantasy XIII's characters are fairly unlikable for most of the story. In Final Fantasy XIII-2, the characters are very likable from the jump, and only get better over the length of the game. The story in Final Fantasy XIII is indigestible, with all the terminology and lore that's hidden in data logs. In Final Fantasy XIII-2, the story is explicitly told to you, and is fairly easy to follow, with just the supplementary information being doomed to the data logs. Final Fantasy XIII-2 is almost a perfect sequel, but it doesn't really feel like a sequel. It's more like a really, really good spin-off. Let me elaborate. The story. So I can't talk about the story of Final Fantasy XIII-2 without talking about the story of Final Fantasy XIII, including the ending. And in general, I can't talk about Final Fantasy XIII-2 without talking about Final Fantasy XIII and the various aspects of that game that this game addresses, and the things that this game carries over from Final Fantasy XIII. I also have to talk about Final Fantasy XIII-2's general premise in the opening segment in order to explain what I think about the story. But past these opening segments, there will be no major spoilers for Final Fantasy XIII-2 in this video. If you want to see my take on Final Fantasy XIII in 2023, you can check out my previous video in the upper right hand corner now, or in the description later. But here's your last chance to click off the video to avoid spoilers for Final Fantasy XIII. So in Final Fantasy XIII, you have a team of 6 that is fighting their fates by trying to stop the potential catastrophe of the upper world of Cocoon falling onto the lower world of Pulse, and in the process killing millions of innocent people. Our team stops this from happening, with 2 characters, Vanille and Fang, sacrificing themselves by turning themselves into crystal and creating a crystal pillar to uphold the upper world of Cocoon from falling onto the lower world of Pulse. The rest of our crew, Saz, Snow, Hope, and Lightning, also get turned into crystal, but then immediately get released from this crystal imprisonment to assumedly happily live out the rest of their days. Final Fantasy XIII-2 picks up 3 years after these events, with Lightning's sister Sarah, who is released from her crystal slumber at the end of Final Fantasy XIII. For some reason, Lightning is missing, and Sarah is the only one that has specific memories of Lightning surviving these events at the end of Final Fantasy XIII. Everyone else believes that Lightning died or was trapped in the crystal upholding the upper world of Cocoon. However, Final Fantasy XIII-2 starts off with you playing as Lightning, fighting a mysterious new enemy in a novel area, making it presumptuous that Lightning is alive and that something is awry. Another new character by the name of Noel is introduced into the world that Lightning is currently in, and Lightning instructs this Noel to protect her sister Sarah and bring Sarah to Lightning. Lightning also gives Noel the creature Mog, who can turn into a weapon for Sarah to use. Noel then gets transported to Sarah, gives her Mog, and explains that Lightning is in a place called Valhalla. Valhalla is separate from time and space. Noel also explains that he's from the future, where he's the only living person left, and that he and Sarah need to get to Lightning in Valhalla by jumping to different locations across time and space. See what I mean about this being more of a spin-off than a sequel? This is a great setup though, and it gives the story the opportunity to be more dynamic and absolutely less linear. Throughout your journey in Final Fantasy XIII-2, you go to several places from the previous game and isolated levels and throughout different time periods. There's also a general path to take for completion of the story, but there are also areas that branch out that are either optional or that can be tackled out of order from the main storyline. Having to go to the same area in different time periods and having to backtrack in a way automatically makes this game not linear, and this is only supplemented by the optional areas and the ability to tackle certain areas out of chronological order from the main storyline. This does wonders for the overall story. From the beginning, there's a lot of intrigue as to what's really going on, and you essentially put together the pieces of the puzzle the way that you want them to, with the main storyline giving you the main pieces of the puzzle, and the side content fleshing out the world and the story appropriately. I really liked Final Fantasy XIII's story, and it's pretty much streamlined to you through the progression of the game because there's almost no side content until you get into the very last sections of the game. But there's a lot of lore and world building that is almost exclusively done through excessive data log entries, which I believe to be bad design and bad storytelling. Final Fantasy XIII-2 tells you the story, or more so shows you the story, by having you play the game and interact with NPCs. Let me tackle these one by one. This time, the story is just told to you through the game, and it's not nearly as confusing as the previous game. A time-traveling plot, by nature, is typically confusing. And if there's anything confusing here, it's because of this. But the story is slowly told to you piece by piece and pretty thoroughly explained. There is still specific terminology that is important to remember, but there's not as much of it, and it's not as complicated as Final Fantasy XIII's Fal'Cie, L'Cie, Seath, Pulse, Cocoon, Psychom, etc. Hell, they even use some of the terminology in this game, and it's not as confusing as it was in Final Fantasy XIII. And unlike Final Fantasy XIII, there's NPCs in this game, and they not only can hand out side quests, they also give supplementary information towards the story and the lore of the world. This game also has data logs, just like Final Fantasy XIII did, but there are a lot less of them, and they're typically just for reinforcing information that was already given and not hiding crucial information for the story. There are a few exceptions though, like the reason why Sarah and Noel and other people can use magic. This is locked away in data logs, but this is the exception and absolutely not the rule. Final Fantasy XIII-2's story is a mesh of very serious and deep moments that can actually get a bit dark and emotional. But there's also very lighthearted moments that are almost super anime in nature, but very charming. I said this about Final Fantasy XIII as well, but it's even more so in this game. This time around, the story is primarily focused on our two characters, Sarah and Noel, with the villain Caius along with his companion Yule, with supportive roles being filled out by main characters from the previous game, Final Fantasy XIII. The characters. The quality of the characters in this game is incredibly surprising in the best of ways. I've played a humble but healthy amount of video games spanning across all genres, and Sarah and Noel are some of the best written and voice acted protagonists that I've ever experienced. Noel puts a massive importance on life and trying to save the ones that he cares for, and people as a whole, because he is from a time where he is the last person. He has experienced true loneliness and sadness at the end of all things. So no matter what happens, or how much hopelessness there is in the story of Final Fantasy XIII-2, he always has hope, simply because he has someone else to keep alive, Sarah. Sarah, on the other hand, has only ever been surrounded by people that love her and that she loves. Now, however, Lightning is gone. Everyone thinks Lightning's dead, except for Sarah, who has specific memories of her being alive after the fall of Cocoon at the end of Final Fantasy XIII. Sarah's fiancé, Snow, believes Sarah, but doesn't share these memories. So Snow goes off on a mission to find Lightning and bring her back to Sarah. So he's left her too. Fang and Vanille are trapped in the Crystal Pillar upholding Cocoon. Saz and Hope are out living their lives somewhere. And now Sarah's just sitting at her new home on the lower world of Pulse, waiting for Snow to come back after being gone for years, and hopefully with Lightning. Essentially, Sarah has lost everyone that she cares for, with the main ones being her sister and her fiancé Snow. So when Noel comes to town, explaining that Lightning is alive, and that she asked for Noel to deliver Sarah to her, this gives Sarah and Noel purpose again, and they may save themselves from a potential future of despair, with Sarah losing the ones that she cares for the most, and Noel having the same done to him, while also experiencing the dread of the end of the world. This is great writing, and a phenomenal setup for these two people that don't know each other to come together and fulfill their objectives. The contrast and similarities of these characters also forge a wonderful fellowship that allows for a magnificent experience listening and watching these two interact and bond over the story. Oh yeah, that's right. There is significant dialogue between these two throughout the entirety of the story, and it's really good. The voice acting in the English dub is fantastic. Practically all lines are delivered exceptionally well. There are a lot of lines that really need to be said in a specific tone or said in a particular way due to the line's main purpose being to convey emotion, and the voice actors absolutely nail almost every one of these lines. Final Fantasy XIII has lines like these too that are also done very well, but the inner character writing in Final Fantasy XIII-2 is just so much better than Final Fantasy XIII's. So this allows for the quality of the voice acting to shine so much more. Noel and Sarah work together very well as your two main party members. I'll talk about Caius and Yule in just a minute, but I want to take some time and talk about Sarah a little bit more. Sarah is one of the best written female protagonists that I've had the pleasure to play and experience throughout the story of Final Fantasy XIII-2. In Final Fantasy XIII, I really like Lightning and Fang for being the badasses that they are and just cool characters in general. Sarah's not like that at all, really. She's very kind, caring, innocent, and emotionally intelligent. She's a ray of hope in a hopeless world, and she brings out the best in people around her. She's very feminine, but she's strong and virtuous. Most female leads are your typical badass woman, which are definitely cool. Fang is my favorite character from Final Fantasy XIII, with Lightning being my second favorite. And typically the more feminine women are only ever stereotypically damsels in distress. Vanille is somewhat of a good example of this. However, Sarah is feminine and strong. This is so refreshing. I legitimately cannot think of another game that does this. Such a great character to have in the series. Another wonderful character is Caius, the main villain of Final Fantasy XIII-2. Caius is the typical badass character that has unwavering resolve to see his mission through. And in Final Fantasy XIII-2, his mission isn't one of villainy in the typical sense of doing evil things for the sake of evilness, but instead he wants to save his companion Yule from a terrible fate by doing something that is evil. To him, this is the necessary evil. This already gives him a significant amount of depth, and it only improves when you get to explore the relationship between him and Yule, him and Noel, and all three of them together to each other. This is a great angle to take for Final Fantasy XIII-2's main villain, and really, it was ahead of its time. And like Noel and Sarah, the way that he's written and voice acted is excellent. Caius is a fantastic villain. Yule's interesting. Yule is somewhat of a docile character, and is often one note. But this is intentional because she is essentially the muse to the events of the story and has a unique quality to her in the sense that there are multiple versions of her. For the supernatural nature that embodies her, I think this character writing is completely appropriate. However, in very particular and important parts of the story, you do see her express emotions. And she shows that under the semi-divine role that she has to undertake, there's very much a human soul that resides within her. Therefore, I think that she's a very solid character for the story. Lightning is very much the same Lightning from Final Fantasy XIII, especially towards the end of the game, where she's more stoic. Again, I really like Lightning, so I really enjoyed her in this story, and I like that she's essentially the MacGuffin for Noel and Sarah's journey across time and space. I feel like it's a very bold move to remove the main playable character of the first game from the second game, and here I think it works very well. Hope is a surprisingly prominent supporting character and is present throughout a large portion of the story, and it's an older version of Hope. This new Hope is more mature, intelligent, and much more likable than Final Fantasy XIII's version of him. And like everyone else in the game, he's written and voice acted very well. This is really cool. It's like Hope gets a bit of a redemption arc in this game. It makes you like Final Fantasy XIII's Hope a little bit more too. Mog is a weird and mysterious character that is never really explained, but I like him. You know how I said this game has very serious moments, and moments that contrast these serious moments with very goofy and anime moments? Mog is the goofy anime moment, but he's charming, and I like him. I think he's a good addition. The various NPCs of the game are also written very well. This time around, there are a ton more NPCs that not only talk to you, but they also talk to each other in a way that can be overheard, and they dump a lot of lore and interesting complementary information. Some of them even have small contained stories that are very intriguing as well. This is a very fun addition to the Final Fantasy XIII formula. And of course, I couldn't forget everybody's favorite character.
I'm Chocolina, super time-traveling sales girl!
Chocolina is another mysterious character that freely hops across time and space, and will follow your party to various different levels that you venture to, and she sells you goods. She's super spunky, energetic, quirky, and has several one-liners that either make you chuckle or cringe. I chuckled every time. I really liked her inclusion, and always enjoyed interacting with her. You know what I also really liked? The soundtrack. The soundtrack. Final Fantasy XIII's soundtrack is outstanding and is some of the best video game music of all time. Final Fantasy XIII-2's soundtrack is better. To be fair, most of the soundtrack is from the previous game, with some new tracks and remix tracks from Final Fantasy XIII. Since this is a sequel, I think this is perfectly fine. The new tracks and remix tracks, and several songs from Final Fantasy XIII, make the variety of this game's soundtrack just slightly better than Final Fantasy XIII's, which in my opinion, Final Fantasy XIII's soundtrack is a masterpiece. So Final Fantasy XIII-2's soundtrack is also a masterpiece, just a slightly better one. Here's some of my favorite new tracks. Final Fantasy 13-2 soundtrack, absolutely wonderful. Visuals. Final Fantasy 13-2 runs on the same engine as Final Fantasy 13, so it looks very similar to the previous game, which is a good thing. Final Fantasy 13-2 still to this day looks phenomenal. Since this is a sequel, a lot of assets from Final Fantasy 13 were used in this game, and the general aesthetic is still the same in this game. Yet there is a significant switch in main character design. Sarah, Noel, and Caius have character designs that more resemble Kingdom Hearts than Final Fantasy 13. This is a hit or miss depending on what you like. I personally really like Sarah and Noel's design, even though the outfit change for Sarah is not explained at all. But the design of Caius is a bit much for me, along with his weapon design. I don't hate it, I just think it doesn't fit the world. But overall, the visuals and art direction of this game are fantastic. Gameplay. So they actually significantly switched up the gameplay this time around. In Final Fantasy 13, you were basically running in a line from point A to point B and battling. That was about it. In Final Fantasy 13-2, a lot more is going on. So running from point A to point B is still essentially the name of the game here. But there are levels now, and each level has several branching areas that are explorable but not necessary. And there is a lot of backtracking to previously visited areas or going to the same area in a different time. Some of these areas that are available in different times also open up previously blocked off sections that were not accessible during the first run through. And since there are levels this time, instead of a singular progressive world, you're pretty much allowed to travel from place to place as you please. This is a neat switch from the previous game of having just a standard linear world. I still very much like the world of Final Fantasy 13 and enjoying the linearity of it because it felt very tightly knitted on what exactly the world wanted the player to experience in terms of difficulty, cinematic spectacle, tone, and ambience. However, Final Fantasy 13-2's levels are very well crafted and make for a nice change of pace and destroy the linearity problem of Final Fantasy 13. Oh, and you can jump too. That's pretty cool. I'll get to battling in a second, but unlike Final Fantasy 13, Final Fantasy 13-2 has so much more in terms of gameplay. So I'm going to talk about that now. From practically the beginning of the game, you have access to side quests by interacting with NPCs. And it's not just hunt missions like Final Fantasy 13. You of course have these missions, but you also have retrieval missions, exploratory missions, and wholly unique missions. None are particularly super exciting, unfortunately, but they're there if you want to do more. You also have quick time events. This is kind of fun and interesting, but again, nothing excessively exciting. You also have life triggers, which are dialogue choices, or simple choices, that your character will make when conversing with another character or when deciding on what to do next, respectively. This is very interesting because some of the dialogue choices have 4 different options from which you are to choose from, and usually it's in the form of asking a question, and again you can only choose one. Therefore, there's still a lot of information or character interactions that you were probably shorted on based off your choices. This would be a problem if the game wasn't intentionally trying to be a bit mysterious, and if the overall story wasn't told to you effectively, but that's not the case. So I think the system works out very well. And on top of that, some of the choices that you make with the system can lead to a new cutscene or even a new ending. Yeah, this game has multiple endings, which is also super cool, and they are all, at the very least, interesting. There's one main ending though, with all the other endings being supplementary ones. There are also puzzles, nothing super elaborate, but interesting and fun ones nonetheless. There are 2 main ones, with you having to connect crystals together in the right order, and the other one having you eliminate numbers on a clock face in the right order. Once you understand how the first one works, it's not too bad, but if you're not paying attention, you can fail the puzzle by running out of time. But the second one can become very difficult, but not particularly frustrating, which made the puzzle fun. These puzzles were a welcome addition. There's also a whole level that is essentially a casino where you can gamble for specific prizes and do chocobo races, which is really deep in terms of mechanics. You don't need to go here, but it is something else to do if you want more from this game. This is neat as a whole, and I tried the slots in the chocobo racing, and it was cool, but it's just not for me. But it's here if you want. Speaking of chocobos, there's a lot more of them, and you can ride them pretty much right away, which is magnificent. They act as a way to travel through the levels really quickly without encountering enemies. I'll talk about the enemy encounters when I talk about the battle system, so hang tight. They also allow you to access certain areas that are otherwise unattainable. However, there is a balance to this. It costs a limited resource every time you mount a chocobo, called Gaishol Greens, and one is consumed every time you mount a chocobo, and certain NPCs and gates are not available to be interacted with while you're on the back of a chocobo. This is a great addition to the levels that does nothing but make the levels better. The only drawback is the rambunctious chocobo later in the story. They're just inferior versions of regular chocobos in every way, and I'll talk more about them at the end of the video. But overall, chocobos are really good. Mog. You know that weird creature that I brought up earlier that follows Sarah and Noel around and turns into Sarah's weapons? Well, he actually has a few abilities that affect gameplay as well. There are various different items, or sometimes people or objects, in different times in specific areas that Mog can reveal with his mysterious powers. This is also interesting because there's a lot of items that can barely be seen in the current time, that if you catch the glint of the light from just the right angle, or you see it floating up and down with the light bouncing off of it, This clues you in that something might be there, and as you get close to it, Mog informs you that there is indeed something there, and he can use his powers to put it in your current timeline and thus be accessible. Mog can also be thrown to reach treasure spheres in a distance that your character cannot get to. Again, this is also neat. Not really necessary in my opinion, but overall, it's a cool idea, so why not? And finally, for the last non-battle gameplay mechanic, we have the way in which you progress new levels, which are gates. Gates are essentially doors that are needed to be unlocked to get to another level. This is typically done through completing the main storyline, or a certain objective for the side areas, which use up a limited resource known as a wild artifact. Once open, the gates take you to the Historia Crux, which is basically the map of the game. It allows you to travel to any level that is currently unlocked, and unlocking a new gate unlocks a new level. For this game, which is about time travel, and with the assumed desire of it to be non-linear, the gates are a great way to introduce new levels, and the Historia Crux is a fantastic tool to access these levels. From the beginning of the game, when you get access to the Historia Crux, you see exactly how many levels there are, and how they're all connected. So in a way, this gives you an idea to what exactly you missed in previous levels, what levels you don't have unlocked yet, and how much further you really are with the main story, with the main story levels being in the middle of the layout, and the side levels being towards the side of the layout, either above or below the main story. The Historia Crux is a great tool for navigating through the various different levels of this game, and I'm glad it's here. The battle system. So now let's talk about the big boy, the battle system. Let's start with the way you encounter enemies. In Final Fantasy XIII, enemy counters were pre-arranged placements of enemies throughout your journey. In Final Fantasy XIII-2, encounters are random, and they appear after you walk a certain algorithmic determined amount of steps. This plays well into some of the other systems within the battle system, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. So overall, I think this is the correct move for this game. When enemies appear, you have a certain amount of time displayed at the bottom of the screen, indicated by the mob clock, to strike the enemy and start the battle. If you strike before the clock runs out, you automatically get a preemptive strike. But if you let the time run out, you are locked into battle with the enemy until it finishes without a preemptive strike, and without the option of retrying the battle. There's also a general radius in which the system works, and if you manage to get outside of this radius, the enemy or enemies will despawn, and you no longer need to battle. Again, I think this system works very well with the new mechanics of the battle system, so overall this is a great addition. The preemptive strike also works a little different from the previous game to make up for the ease of execution of it in this game and the overall power of it in the prior game. So in Final Fantasy XIII, the preemptive strike only happened when you approach the enemy when they had their backs turned to you, and it put the enemy 1 point away from being staggered, which is a huge advantage to the overall battle, but in Final Fantasy XIII-2 balances this mechanic out by making it easier to do but less powerful. This time in Final Fantasy XIII-2, preemptive strikes only does 120% of chain gauge buildup, which is a great compensation for the frequency of use of this mechanic. And of course, after the preemptive strike, it takes you to the battle system proper. So the battle system in Final Fantasy XIII-2 is a remixed version of Final Fantasy XIII's battle system, which I loved. The same rules still apply. You have ATB segments that give you the option to put in manual commands for the character that you are directly controlling, and again you can only control one character, or you can just use the auto battle button, which autofills these segments with the seemingly best options. Just like in Final Fantasy XIII, I think the auto battle button is by far the way to go for most battles. Also, like Final Fantasy XIII, the name of the game is staggering and paradigm shifting. Staggering an enemy increases their vulnerability and the amount of damage that you do to them. And it works just like how it did in Final Fantasy XIII, where you build up a chain gauge to its staggering point, which is different for every enemy type, and then the enemy becomes staggered once it crosses the staggering point. When staggered, the staggered percentage usually jumps up at least 100%. The staggering percentage is also how much extra damage you do to said enemy. And once the enemy is staggered, the staggered percentage can go up even further and more quickly. Paradigm shifting is used to switch your party members into different roles so that you more effectively reach this staggered point while also keeping your party alive and healthy. Paradigm shifting works just like it did in Final Fantasy XIII, and this is great. You have the same 6 roles as you did in Final Fantasy XIII, which are Commando, Ravager, Sentinel, Synergist, Medic, and Saboteur. And again, the Commando is the primary physical damage role that also limits the depletion of the chain gauge so that staggering is easier and more consistent. Ravager is the primary magic damage dealing role and also the primary chain gauge increasing role. The drawback here is that the Ravager attacks vastly increase the chain gauge of enemies, but also rapidly decreases the window for follow-up attacks to maintain the same chain gauge buildup. This is offset by the Commando role, so it strikes a nice balance between these two. The Sentinel role is your stereotypical tank role, where they divert enemy attention away from the other party members and have significantly more resistance to damage. This allows your party members to be more effective at their roles. The Medic role is pretty self-explanatory. They heal and revive the party members. The Saboteur role is for debuffing enemies, and the Synergist is for buffing your party. This time around, there are some significant changes to each role as well, because they are balanced around the most significant change of the battle system, the third party member. In Final Fantasy 13-2, you only ever play as either Noel or Sarah, and you can actually switch between them really whenever you want as long as they are alive. And if one expires, you automatically switch to the other one. But the third party member is actually a monster that you have captured. This is a great system, and I love the inclusion of monsters being your third party member. Let me explain how it works. So the game starts you off pretty early with an introduction to the system, and gives you your first monster. From there you're able to capture monsters freely, and build up your roster of potential monster party paradigm choices. You capture monsters by defeating them in battle, but there's only ever a certain percentage chance you have for capturing said monster. So in a way, it's a game of luck. You can have up to 3 monsters in your party paradigm, and assign them to any paradigm pack. And in the paradigm packs, the monsters will occupy the third position. Paradigm packs are specific paradigms that you make to have each character in a specific role for battling. You have up to 6 of these paradigm packs that you can fully customize. And you have up to 3 monsters that you can assign to the third space in these paradigm packs. Again, I know I already said this, but it warrants repeating. Each monster has only one role that they can occupy. So for example, the red chocobo is a commando only, while the blue chocobo is a ravager only. Therefore, since you have 3 different monsters available to you in your party paradigm, you typically want this to be filled out with monsters of different roles, in order to be able to fill out your paradigm packs with specific roles that fit your playstyle. Again, I really love this. I think it's super cool. I think it's a big part of what makes this game what it is. However, this wouldn't work if it wasn't balanced correctly, but thankfully it is. This mechanic is very much like Pokemon, and like Pokemon, as you go through the game you get better and better monsters. So, you're encouraged to switch monsters in and out of your party paradigms. But there's a lot of flexibility with this. Certain monsters have different ways in which they level up, and only ever have certain moves available to them, naturally. So even though they may be stronger than the monsters that you already have in said role, your current monster may be more effective at doing what you want them to do than the new monster that's more powerful. However, if you level up a new monster, it may be more effective than the monster that you have equipped now. Also, some monsters peak super early and offer a quicker advantageous moveset and stats, but may become obsolete later down the road. And the materials used to level up said monster are more or less limited if you don't want to grind for hours to get more of them. So, this offers you with a flexible choice of what you want to do with your monsters. You can also infuse monsters into other monsters, which transfers some of the moves and passive abilities from the monster being infused to the monster consuming said monster. So you can build up a super monster essentially, and not have other monsters sitting around in your inventory that have good skills or moves that are no use to you. This is such a good system that makes this game super interesting. Let me give you an example of how I assign my Ravager position. My go-to paradigm is Relentless Assault, which is a Ravager, a Commando, and another Ravager. I have Sarah as my controllable Ravager, Noel as my Commando, and a monster as my secondary Ravager. At the beginning of the game, I had a Gremlin as my secondary Ravager. He's pretty weak overall, and offers little in terms of upgrade ability. Not much later in the story, I captured a Flambonero, which is just basically an overall stronger monster with the same limitations as the Gremlin. I then captured a Bookaboo at about the halfway point of the game, which is one of the best limited Ravagers in the game. My Bookaboo is very strong early on and can get much stronger very quickly, but he has limitations. He has a limited moveset, he's slow due to his limited ATB gauge, and even though you can max him out early and cost effectively, he becomes less than optimal in the late game. So what did I do with my Bookaboo? Well, I max leveled him early on and infused another monster into him so that he had 2 different elemental moves for damage dealing. I then used him in battle up to the very end of the game, and he pretty much cleaned house during this time. Towards the last sections of the game, I captured a blue chocobo, which is one of the best in-game Ravagers. However, in order for the blue chocobo to become one of the best Ravagers, it has to reach its max level, or at least get close to it, which is level 99. My Bookaboo's max level was 20. And as you can expect, the materials needed to level up my blue chocobo were much less common, and I needed significantly more materials overall when compared to my Bookaboo's leveling. I max leveled my Bookaboo with materials that I had collected from just playing the game. I had to grind for a few hours to get the materials that I needed to max level my blue chocobo. And on top of that, my blue chocobo also didn't have 2 of the 4 elements of magic damage. So I decided to level up 2 more monsters that had those elements in order to get more powerful moves in those elements, and then infuse those monsters into my blue chocobo. This also took another couple hours. But once it was all done, my blue chocobo was downright nasty with its damage dealing capacity. This guy was destroying the enemies, and the last boss wasn't even a challenge for my guy. This was so fun progressing this role and position in my paradigm packs, and I'm glad they added this to the game, and I'm glad that they balanced it so well. But speaking about leveling up, let's talk about the leveling system in this game. The Crystarium. So the Crystarium is back from Final Fantasy 13, but it's more streamlined, and I think it loses some of the quality of the previous system. But since this game is more focused on other aspects, especially with the monsters that you capture in this game, having the Crystarium more simplified is probably a good choice. So you have the Crystarium for both Sarah and Noel, and every captured monster. The Crystarium for Sarah and Noel allows them to level up through Crystarium points that you earn from battles and completing story missions and side quests. So let me talk about Sarah and Noel's Crystariums first. Their Crystariums work in identical ways to each other. It's essentially a straight line of progression for each different role with an overall line of progression that has specific stages, in which once you pass a certain stage, you get a Crystarium bonus. To more clearly explain, there are 22 overall stages in the Crystarium, and after you advance from one stage to the next, you gain a Crystarium bonus. The first stage requires you to level up 22 times in order to advance to the second stage. You can level up whatever role you like, or level up some levels on one role, and then switch to another role, and then switch to another, and so on. Once you hit 22 levels of overall leveling, you hit stage 2 of the overall Crystarium. And it progresses from stage 2 to stage 3 when you gain 20 more levels, or when you gain 42 levels overall. And from stage 3 to stage 4, it's 21 more levels, or 63 levels overall, and so on and so forth, with each level becoming slightly more expensive in terms of Crystarium points. This is pretty cool, and I'm glad we got this instead of just a simple number increasing system or something of that nature. But I really enjoyed the Crystarium of Final Fantasy XIII and its visual design, and I wish we would have gotten this system in Final Fantasy XIII 2, or at least a bit of a visual upgrade to this new system that's in Final Fantasy XIII 2, with maybe some branching options that give you a little bit more of a choice. But I guess the branching options are more so the Crystarium bonuses, so I'm okay with that. The Crystarium bonuses range from a few different options, but the main ones are role bonuses, ATB segment increases,
and unlocking new roles and increasing accessory capacity.
And during the Crystarium expansion, you can pick one of these several different bonuses. Therefore, you have more flexibility in how you want to customize Sarah and Noel to your playstyle. This is great customizability, and I think it works very well with the upgrading system of this game. The monster Crystariums function very similarly to Sarah and Noel's Crystariums, in which they also have Crystarium bonuses with each stage expansion. But each monster's Crystarium is unique to each individual monster, and thus gives each monster their own moveset and stats. Like I was explaining with my Bookaboo, he maxes out at level 20, while my Blue Chocobo maxes out at level 99. As a consequence of this, my Bookaboo had less Crystarium bonuses due to his limited level. When my Bookaboo maxed out, he only had 3 ATB segments, whereas my Blue Chocobo had 6. Again, I love this for more so of the balancing of the monsters than anything else. But speaking of balance, let's talk about weapons and accessories. Weapons and accessories. So I really didn't talk about much of the weapons and accessories from Final Fantasy XIII in my prior video, which will be linked in the description, so go check it out if you haven't. And like most things in Final Fantasy XIII 2, the weapons and accessories in this game are more of a response to the weapons and accessories in Final Fantasy XIII. So I'm going to have to explain the weapons and accessory systems in Final Fantasy XIII in order to talk about Final Fantasy XIII 2's version of these systems, but I'll do it really quickly. So in Final Fantasy XIII, there are 8 families of weapons per character, with each family being upgradable into 2 weapons that are more powerful. Each family has its own identity, all offering a specific passive ability and unique stat differences or debuffs that balance the added passive abilities. Or the weapon family offers no passive abilities in exchange for higher stats, or easy accessibility, or an easier upgrade path. Weapons are upgradable, but by using materials collected from defeating enemies in battle, or by buying them at the shop at the save kiosk. Each item has an XP value, along with a hidden multiplier value, that will make the following components either higher or lower XP values. Once the weapon reaches its max level, it needs a specific catalyst to upgrade into the next weapon in the family, and to continue the leveling process. This, as a general leveling design, is very interesting and fun. However, it's very complicated because the hidden multiplier for the component is hidden, thus never displayed. Nor are you told which catalyst you need to upgrade a weapon to the next weapon in the family. And a lot of the necessary components that you need to be effective at upgrading are limited to the later part of the game, and they are scarce. Not to mention, the best weapon families are typically towards the end of the game. So if you level up a weapon early in the game, you are probably leveling an inferior weapon ineffectively and using up valuable resources. If you wait until the end of the game, you can level up approximately 1 weapon per your 3 primary party members to about the halfway point. The accessories act much in the same way, but are more diverse and numerous. Because of this, the weapons and accessory systems as a whole are typically seen as a failure by most. And I would have to agree, only because there's not enough transparency and the pacing is very poor. So, how did Final Fantasy XIII 2 address this? Well, you just buy better weapons for the most part. There's basically 3 weapon families in this game. Now with one having very high stats, but no passive abilities, one having the passive ability to increase the charge rate of your ATB segments, and the last one having increased buildup of the enemy's chain gauge. All of these families stay consistent throughout the game, and simply better options with higher stats and greater versions of their passive abilities become available for purchase after you clear specific milestones in the main story. You can find some weapons throughout the story in certain levels, but most weapons will be bought from Chocolina, with Gil and specific rare monster components. You do find a lot of accessories though throughout your journey. so that's good. Accessories are also changed from Final Fantasy XIII. In Final Fantasy XIII, accessories were able to be upgraded, as I previously explained, but accessory slots were tied to the advancement of the Crystarium, and once you obtained an extra accessory slot, you simply had another slot to equip an extra accessory. Final Fantasy XIII-2 also has accessories linked to the Crystarium expansion, but through accessory points. Now in Final Fantasy XIII-2, each accessory has an accessory value, and each character has accessory points. In order to equip the accessory, you need to have the same amount of accessory points of said accessory or higher. And when the accessory is equipped, it will take up the amount of accessory points that is equivalent to its value. So if Null, for instance, has 70 accessory points, he can equip an accessory that costs 65 points. But he can also equip an accessory that costs 45 points and add another accessory that only costs 30 points. The amount of accessory points can be increased with one of the bonuses of the Crystarium expansion. Personally, I didn't hate or love these changes. I really like the system of upgrading in Final Fantasy XIII and would love to see a refined version of it. You know, something that a remake could do? Please? But for Final Fantasy XIII-2, there are so many new systems that should probably take the focus of the game, like the monster capturing system, the time traveling mechanics, and exploration, and various other forms of gameplay, that these changes to the weapons and accessories make sense. Plus, I felt that the accessories did not make much of a difference throughout my playthrough. The weapons definitely did, but they were pretty easy to get after you obtained the appropriate components and cleared the story milestones. The story again, no spoilers, just thoughts. I love the story of this game. I think it's one of the best Final Fantasy stories to date. This is a sequel to Final Fantasy XIII, obviously, but it really feels like a spin-off, and more specifically a character spin-off, of Sarah and her adventure. I think that the overall plot is very interesting, and it has a lot of depth that is built upon throughout the story, but more importantly, through character interactions. Not that Final Fantasy XIII didn't do this, but this time, it's just two protagonists and one antagonist, with a complicated relationship to one of the main protagonists. The story is more intimate, and this is shown through Sarah and Noel's dialogue. And I already said this, but the writing is fantastic in this game. And as the story progresses, it very much turns into a more bombastic, blockbuster, cinematic experience that Final Fantasy XIII was, which is a big reason why I like Final Fantasy XIII. But I also like the character-driven moments in Final Fantasy XIII, and 13-2 has so much more of that. And by the end, I really connected with these characters so much more than I did with Final Fantasy XIII's characters. And that's saying something, because at the end of Final Fantasy XIII, I felt as if I connected with those characters pretty strongly as well. So that should tell you just how strongly I feel about these characters in 13-2. For the plot, I think they really do some interesting things, especially with the time traveling mechanics. This is a very interesting system, and they put it to great use. Definitely one of the best time traveling stories that I've experienced, especially with the multiple endings. This makes so much sense to have multiple endings for a game based around time travel. And I know I've said this before, but I'd like to say it again. I at least liked all the side endings, and I really liked the overall plot of the story. But what about the main ending? So there's definitely some discourse around the main ending, and I will not spoil it here, but I think that the main ending is excellent, and one of the best endings to a Final Fantasy game. A big portion of the discourse will say that it came out of nowhere. It's just a setup for the third game in the trilogy, Lightning Returns, Final Fantasy XIII. By the way, if you want to see me do a video on that, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, turn on the bell notification, that way you don't miss out on any future videos, and leave a comment. While I think the story for Lightning Returns was already formulated, at least as an idea, while the end of 13-2 was made, I don't think that this ending is just a setup for that game. I think this ending was told to the player from the very beginning, but it just didn't seem like it was going to happen. But it was constantly reminded to the player that this was going to happen if we keep progressing the story, and then it does happen. I love these kind of endings that are hidden in plain sight from the very beginning, but obscured for one reason or another. Also think it's very bold, and it fits the world of the game, and I applaud the writers for having this as the ending. The plot and story to this game, I absolutely loved it. The pitfalls of a sequel. When you have a sequel and you change things from the previous game, these changes are immediately going to be criticized due to the nature of the game being the sequel, just like I've been doing throughout this whole video. And while I've mostly praised this game, and I do think it's a wonderful sequel, I have some issues with some of the few new things that they introduced and the things that they changed from Final Fantasy XIII. So, let's start off with the most annoying one, the lag. I played this game on Xbox Series X, which apparently is the best place to play the game, according to the Steam reviews. I still had several instances where the game would lag tremendously during gameplay sections and cinematic cutscenes, where the frame rate would drop down to the single digits. In some cases, I had to pause the game and let it load more, or quit the game entirely, or go back to the Story of Crux, and then back to the level that I was on to stop the lag. This absolutely sucked, and definitely hampered my experience with the game. Thankfully, there typically was an easy fix to this by the previous things that I just mentioned, but it was always at least annoying, and when the lag interfered with cutscenes, I absolutely missed certain aspects about the story, and it took me out of the experience completely. I wish they would have patched this game to fix this issue, but the developers act like this game and the trilogy as a whole doesn't exist, so I won't hold my breath. The second most annoying thing was lack of explanation as a whole. A vast majority of the mechanics in this game were intuitive due to these mechanics being carried over from Final Fantasy XIII. However, most of the new mechanics and the passive progression were hardly ever explained. For the mechanics, a great example is the Hand of Time temporal rift puzzles. Whenever you first encounter these puzzles, there's a little prompt that basically explains that you need to activate all pads so that each pad gets activated in the appropriate order to remove all the pads. The hands on the clock will move according to the pads that you choose. Therefore, each pad has a specific way in which the arms on the clock will move. And that's about it for the explanations. What I didn't realize was that these pads were numbers. So for the first several versions of this puzzle, I just randomly got the right order due to the difficulty of these first puzzles being pretty low. However, when the puzzles got more difficult, I got stuck and couldn't figure out what these symbols correlated to due to their visual design. I knew that it had to be something related to a clock, and some pads resembled numbers more so than others, but I just couldn't nail it down. For instance, I knew that the pad with a straight line vertically probably represented a 1, so I figured that when I pressed it, it would change to the position of 1 on a standard clock layout, and at times it did based on the layout of the pads, but at other times it didn't. So then I started to think that maybe when I click a certain symbol, it adjusts to the time from where it's at or something of that nature. And that's kind of how it works, but it's not exactly it. Then, after several attempts of trial and error, I finally figured it out. Each pad is a number, and the two hands on the clock move the same spaces away from the number that you choose in both directions. I thought that this was so dumb because a lot of the numbers on the pad look more like symbols more so than numbers. It's apparent that the design of the puzzle was to initially deceive you and to have you figure out the exact mechanics of the puzzle through trial and error, with a mix of deductive reasoning. In a puzzle game, this is a good concept, and is typically followed by resolution of the puzzle. But this is a Final Fantasy game, with a puzzle minigame. And this specific puzzle is the hardest style of puzzle throughout the entire game, and inherently requires several trial and error rounds just to complete the puzzle. Unless of course you're lucky, or Rain Man. Why is there trial and error in figuring out the mechanics of the puzzle? The Crystal Bond puzzle is also like this, where the full mechanics of this puzzle are not fully described to the player right away, but it's more intuitive than the Hand of Time puzzle, so I'm okay with that one. For the lack of explanation on the progression, a great example is when you have to collect 5 very specific items in the main story to progress it any further. There's actually more than 5 of these specific items, but they're scattered in levels that you've already been to, or in levels that you have yet to unlock. And they are only present after you're tasked with finding them. So in other words, you can't pick them up on your first visit through said level that these items are in. And they are in a time distortion, so they are barely visible and have to be uncovered by Mog's abilities. So in summary of this task collecting these items, they are somewhere in other levels, in a specific location in that level, barely visible, and you don't know what levels they're in. This sucks so much. Thankfully, I have the strategy guide to this game, so I just looked up where the 5 easiest items were, and I got those, and called it a day. Yet, when I finished turning in all 5 of these items, I happened to run past a kiosk outside of the area where I turned them in, and I noticed a prompt to interact with this kiosk. When I did, it gave me hints to where all these items were in the game. But the thing is, when you get the task to collect these items, you run past this kiosk before getting the task to get to the area where you get the task from, and there's no prompt to interact with this kiosk. It's as if it's just part of the world design. So, why on earth would anybody stay in the level that gives you a task to go to other levels, collect specific items immediately after getting this task? On top of that, why would I go past this random kiosk that was not working 30 seconds ago and see if I can interact with it now? Again, this wasn't a big deal for me because I had the guide, but the whole time I was collecting these items, I thought to myself, how in the hell does anybody else do this without a guide? And really, so many sections were like this for me. Like I said earlier, the Historia Crux has an outline that shows you all the worlds that you have yet to unlock. And it shows you all the gates in the previous levels, so you know if there's a gate in that level that can be opened to get to a new level. And again, most of this is not explained, or very poorly explained, but it's somewhat intuitive, and I had the guide, so I didn't worry myself with it too much. But I wanted to unlock most of the side levels, so I used the guide to help me plan out a route to unlock new levels and obtain wild artifacts, which are needed to open these new levels, so that I could open as many new levels as possible. Because some of these side levels don't offer wild artifacts, you may go to that level, lose an artifact in going to that level, and not have another artifact to get to a different level. And again, planning out the appropriate route, I don't know how you do this without a guide or look it up. Stuff like this is cool in games like Dark Souls and Elden Ring, but not in a Final Fantasy game, where the story is arguably the selling point of the game, and this holds back the progression of the story. The third most annoying thing was the rambunctious chocobos. This is just a debuff to the standard chocobo encounter. Regular chocobos only cost 1 Gaishol grain every time you mount them, but rambunctious chocobos cost 1 every 30 seconds or so, while offering nothing in return. I really don't like when games do this. This is artificially balancing the in-game economy of the Geishel Greens by inflating the cost of what essentially is the same chocobo riding experience. There's several smarter ways to do this. For example, you could have Chocolina sell Geishel Greens for a higher price and limit the amount of Geishel Greens that you receive from treasure spheres or boxes, and just initially give the player maybe 10 or so that they can experience and utilize the chocobos a healthy amount of times, while not excessively abusing this option for traversal. This is just bad game design. But the rambunctious chocobos do look cool. And oh yeah, what the hell is this? This isn't a bad song by any means, but it just definitely doesn't fit here. Or maybe it does because it's a rambunctious chocobo, and they don't really fit in the game either. I don't know. Now moving away from the annoying things, and on to the disappointing things of this game. We have the handling of the legacy characters. Well, to be more exact, I would just say the handling of Saz. Saz is getting the short stick again, unfortunately. Once more, Hope is handled very well, and he's a great inclusion. And I won't spoil it, but the way they handle Fang and Vanille is great, and I really enjoy what this game does with their characters. And honestly, Snow is handled pretty well too, but he's for sure my least favorite character here, so... But they did my boy Saz dirty. He has a brief cameo that adds nothing to the story, and his story is then fleshed out in DLC that is almost exclusively gambling minigames. And the story in that DLC really explains a lot about what's going on with his character, his son, and how a new character is linked to him, and the origins of said new character. I think it's fine having his story tied to DLC, especially if they don't want to include it in the main game, as they take up space in the main game, and not have the proper inclusion, but not in a frickin' gambling DLC. I don't know what they were thinking with this. But speaking of DLC, let's talk about the DLC for the game. DLC. There's a lot of DLC for this game, and it's quite varied. I'm going to start off with the outfits. This is really cool, and I think they're appropriately priced. Now it's about $1 or $2 per costume, but even back then when it was initially released, I think it was either this price or pretty low. And the outfits look pretty cool. I really like how they changed the look of Mog and how his pack has several different outfits for him. There's also weapon DLC, which is not as cool because these weapons offer an actual change in the gameplay due to the ease of access once purchased. To get the better forms of the DLC weapons, you still have to obtain specific components and have enough gil, but compared to their counterparts, the DLC weapon upgrades are much easier to obtain. However, the DLC weapons have slightly inferior stats when compared to their counterparts, so I guess that is somewhat of a balance. There's also story expansion DLC, but it's very much bite-sized episodes or just additions to the Coliseum, which is a combat arena for this game. I'll do a speed round for all these DLCs. Saz's DLC is a massive disappointment, as I previously explained. The Coliseum editions are really cool, but limited in scope. Lightning's DLC is overall disappointing because it has a very narrowed scope and is limited to a small playtime, but offers more information on the story that is important, and it strongly sets up the third game in the trilogy. Overall, the DLC to this game is cool, and I like that you can pick and choose what to get. If you get this on Steam as well, all this DLC is included, so that's pretty neat. Conclusion. Final Fantasy XIII-2 is a superb game. It has its weaknesses for sure, and I laid out my grievances with it here in this video. But this is truly one of the best stories that I've had the pleasure of playing, and the writing and voice acting are some of the best across the series, and dare I say it, across all JRPGs. Sarah is probably my favorite video game female protagonist. I thoroughly enjoyed seeing her story unfold. The battle system is more refined this time around, and just as fun as the fully opened up battle system from Final Fantasy XIII, if not more fun. The introduction of the monster capturing is one of the best takes on the Pokemon-like monster capturing systems to date. It's a genius way to introduce the third party member, and have a tighter, more focused story with Sarah and Noel at the forefront. The non-linear progression of the story and the level design serve this title wonders, especially coming off the heel of Final Fantasy XIII. The only things holding back this game are the lag and the lack of explanation of various different mechanics. And of course the fact that you probably should have played Final Fantasy XIII. Again, I love Final Fantasy XIII, and I'll defend it until the end, but the main issue with Final Fantasy XIII is that it takes about 20 to 30 hours for it to open up fully, and prior to this, the game kinda drags, especially for newcomers. This is a lot to ask of someone, so I don't blame them for not jumping into the game. But this game, Final Fantasy XIII-2, it's not like that at all, and if you're interested in it, I would strongly recommend picking it up and playing it. If you can't be bothered to play Final Fantasy XIII prior to playing XIII-2, I would still recommend checking out this game and just looking up a story summary of Final Fantasy XIII. If you didn't like Final Fantasy XIII, I would also recommend this game because it fixes almost all the problems of that game in one way or another, and it lets the great aspects of that game shine through to this one. And if you liked Final Fantasy XIII, then I would very strongly recommend this game for all the other reasons that I just explained. This is such a wonderful experience, and I'm so glad I picked it up and played all the way through it. I hope this video sways you to do the same. And if not, thank you anyways for watching. If you want to see more like this, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and hit the bell notification, that way you don't miss out on any future videos. And leave a comment and tell me what you thought about the video, or what you would like to see me do next. Thank you all for the support. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I love seeing what you think about the video or your opinions on the game in the comments. Next up for me is, of course, Lightning Returns Final Fantasy 13. But then again, I could also do Final Fantasy X/X-2, or Final Fantasy 15, or Final Fantasy 7 Remake, or Final Fantasy 12 The Zodiac Age. And you know I'm going to be on that Final Fantasy 16 when it launches. Let me know what you want to see next. But until then, I wish you all the very best, and hope you enjoy. Bye-bye!